Our first speaker today is Malcolm Smith, who recently gave a talk about Garb Dorje about a couple months ago. So we're very happy to welcome you back, Malcolm.
Thank you.
Each speaker will have about half an hour and we'll have questions at the end. I believe the Spanish speakers already have their channel, which is under the interpretation button, in case you're having difficulties finding it. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Malcolm.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John Young. It's my pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about Padmasambhava's Indian context, but not referencing Taranath's biography based on sort of some Tibetan sources and his teacher Buddhagupta Nath's sort of biography. There's a short thing where Taranath basically dismisses the Terma tradition. Instead, what I want to focus on are a couple of important things that we should know about Guru Rinpoche. One of the where we should really start with Guru Rinpoche is we should start by, first of all, disambiguating King Indrabuti. Now, in the Nyingma biography revealed by Nyangral Nima Ozer at the end, during the 12th century, there's this sort of adventure story where King Indrabuti sails, across the ocean to this island called Dhanakosha and discovers this child sitting in a lotus that is then, of course, named Soke Dorje or Saro Rahavajra. But what many people don't know is that there's actually, in Indian sources, there are 3 Indrabutis which are distinguished. We know this principally from a text of Indrabuti 3s, which is called the Sri Tattva Amritopadesha, that is the Amrita Reality Intimate Instruction. And in this text written by Indrabuti III, he mentions that there are 2 previous Indrabutis, and we find this particular reference in the Loju or the Chronicle of an instruction on by Indrabuti on Karma Mudra practice, written down by Jasandapa Gyaltsen, but it comes from an Indian Siddha called Pragnagupta, who's also known as the Red Acharya, sort of a little infamous in Tibetan history. In general, in his sadhana that he wrote, he also describes this particular account as well. And this Pragnagupta was one of the teachers of Drogmi Lotsawa. Now, one of the interesting things is that generally speaking, we normally associate Indrabuti with Odhyana, but in Abhayadatta Shri's account of Saroruha, he clearly places Indrabuti in the region of Kanchi. We have other sort of inconsistencies, for example, where in his great exposition of the Vajrakalaya, the 27th Sakya trees in Yeshe, he points out that there are 2 versions in this Vajrakalaya commentary called Bumnak. One version, it's a womb birth account of Padmasambhava, and another version, it's his sort of miraculous birth account. Maybe this text is about contemporary with the Nyingma biography that I mentioned. In there, he points out that in the womb birth account, Padmasambhava was supposedly born in Zahor, whereas in the miraculously born account, he's supposedly born in Odhyana. And so, of course, Yeshe, being a great sort of text critical kind of person, says this is an inconsistency, and then he discards more or less the womb birth account and then follows Nyingma pretty closely. There's a third account which is extremely interesting, which relates to the Soke Dorje lineage of Rahavajra. And in that particular account, we have the information given by Sachen Kungan Ingpo, that Saroraha was originally named Chandratilaka, and that he was from Odwisha, that he was a Kshatriya, he was from South India. He becomes interested in secret mantra practice. He travels to Odiyana. He meets with this Dakini, this yogini named Chinto. She sends him to Bengal, where he goes and searches out a guru named Anangavajra, alternately also named Jalendra. Now, in this particular story, which is of interest to us, after receiving the Rahavajra empowerment from Anangavajra, he searches out for a mudra, a consort. And because there's a problem between his royal caste and the woman he's chosen to be his consort, the ministers in Bengal, they kind of become very upset, and they conspire to have Rahavajra and his consort burned in a pile of red sandalwood. Now, of course, we all know that at the end of the story, they're going to discover that there's a pool, there's a pond in the middle of this pier. And of course, Rahavajra is unharmed. King Indrabuti, who is actually the king in this particular place, that can't be right because he meets Indrabuti in Odiyana. So the king in this place in Bengal becomes filled with devotion, and they take teachings from him. And then, of course, in the lineage of the Saro Rahavajra lineage, then somehow or other, Soke Dorje or Saroravajra gives the transmission to Indrabuti, then he to his sister, and then it goes 2 generations down to Drogmilosawa in Sakya. Now, people will be familiar with this account because the story of Saroravajra in the Nyingma biography is very, very famous. But Sachen's account precedes Nyingma by some decades. And the other source that we have, which is of great interest in understanding the Indian context of Padmasambhava or Padmavajra, is the supplication to the 84 Mahāsiddhas written by a person named Vajrasanapada and translated by an Indian the practitioner who moved to Tibet and stayed there named Vairocana Rakshata, who is also responsible for translating a large corpus of Mahamudra treatises. And in this, we find in this supplication, we find 2 figures. We find Saroravajra, who is sort of praised for being someone who lives on lotuses, who is from the lunar dynasty in a tamed city. We also find another person of interest to us named Padmakāra. So in this particular supplication, Vajrasana writes this verse. He says, with the form of a bhikshu, relying on a mudra, the subduer of the Rakshasas in the southwest, homage to that guru named Padmakāra. Now, this is interesting because it's certainly the case that we don't really have, as far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong, but as far as I know, there's no account of Guru Rinpoche traveling to the southwest, which incidentally is also named Rakshasa in Sanskrit. So we know that basically to the southwest of India, somehow maybe in those islands, there are cannibals there, Rakshasas. At any rate, the main point is that the first evidence we have of this episode of Padmasambhava leaving and departing from the southwest is not based on a Tibetan source, but rather it's based on an Indian source. We also find, that the Nyingma biography, apparently, I couldn't say this for sure, but it seems that Nyangral uses sort of earlier 11th and early 12th century sources to kind of forge his narrative mythology of Padmasambhava. Why is this important for us? This is important for us because one of the crucial episodes in the Nyingma biography, and in fact in all later Padmasambhava biographies, is this notion that he travels to the southwest and tames Rakshasas. This is also important because it's very clear that the Saroraha account, where he has a consort and is burned by a king, this also appears in all Padmasambhava biographies, but these biographies really, in particular, that episode of being burned alive in a pyre, that seems to come originally through the accounts of the 8 later path cycles, which are connected with the Sakya Lamdre. Now, I'm not claiming that that these people can't be the same, but it does appear to me that in the sort of generating the mythos of Padmasambhava, and also giving Padmasambhava a unique Tibetan identity. That's one of the things. For example, Ganden Chupel mentions that this concept of hats that Tibetan lamas wear couldn't possibly come from India, because in India they don't really have these kinds of hats. And so he speculates that that these hats indeed come from the Chinese. But a friend of mine, a scholar named Hamid Sardar, pointed out to me that the hat that Padmasambhava wears very much resembles the crown of Sasanian kings, the sort of Indo-Iranian people that lived in the area of what is now Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. And so he theorizes that the Padmasambhava's hat is actually due to sort of Sasanian, that is Indo-Iranian influence, and nothing to do with China whatsoever, which makes a little bit of sense when you consider where Swat is, if indeed Padmasambhava, the person we're talking about, actually is from Swat. But this is also not that important, honestly. We can understand that Padmasambhava's myth arose as a way of formalizing and memorializing the imperial period in Tibetan history, where, of course, we have this sort of idea that Padmasambhava came and tamed all the local gods and spirits and subdued the local religious class that was there, which are these days called Bonpos. I'm sure Professor Ramble has plenty to say about that. Maybe not today, but in other places. The main point I'm trying to make, though, is that when we look at how Padmasambhava's myth evolved, we find a great number of Indian sources that, as far as I know, haven't really been looked at and assembled in any kind of a systematic way. Not that I've assembled anything systematically here, because I only have a half an hour to talk. One of the other things I want to point out about Padmasambhava's myth is that Padmasambhava comes, particularly for the Nyingmapas, the sort of quintessential Indian Mahāsiddha. And so we find a number of Padmasambhava, over time, we find a number of tropes from the stories of Indian siddhas wrapped up into Padmasambhava's story. For example, the famous episode where Virupa, halts the sun with his porba in a tavern and drinks until he consumes the wine of 18 kingdoms. This is possible. Many people have the idea that Indians didn't really have wine, but actually I found records of a 1st century Phoenician captain who was importing wine into Mathura specifically, from Sicily and that region. So we know that the Indians like to import wine. So it's quite possible that in addition to their own alcohol, they had wine. So supposedly Virupa, he stops the sun, and we find this story rolled into Guru Rinpoche's general myth cycle. Another thing that we find, which is very interesting about Padmasambhava, is this notion that Padmasambhava is not just someone who communicates tantras to the Tibetans, but we find, for example, in the Kunchok Chidu cycle, there's a small text there called the 8 chapters, and then within that there's a commentary called the Sumeru commentary. And in the Sumeru commentary, Padmasambhava basically declares that his termas are superior to translated texts from Sanskrit, because his terma texts are actually the direct speech of the Sambhogakaya in Tibetan language, without the necessity for being translated. This is a very interesting point, because generally speaking, we can, we think that the sort of normal story about Termas is that they must have been somehow translated by Padmasambhava into some kind of Dakini script, etc., decoded by a Tertan. But here Padmasambhava is actually declaring that in fact, no, these tantras spoken by Padmasambhava, which concern him specifically, are actually his own tantras spoken in Tibetan, not translated. Now, this is an important point for Tibetans, and I believe that one of the reasons why, these other sort of, first of all, these materials that we can look at today very easily were only assembled in the 14th century and the 13th century, beginning with Chomden Rikpe Raltri and concluding with Butun. And prior to this, Tibetans did not have systematic access to the various stories that they received from Indians about Guru Rinpoche that existed in Nyingmapa annals like the Bumnak and so on and so forth. Another point another sort of 11th century text, which is a very interesting in considering the mythos of Padmasambhava in general, is a text by Manjushri Kirti called the Sri Sarva Gyuha Vidhi Garb Alankara. In there, I mentioned this before when I was talking about Garb Georgia the last time. In this particular text, Manjushri Kirti is trying to distinguish between two sort of extreme points of view in Indian Vajrayana during the 8th century, middle of the 8th century. One point of view held that the creation stage is the most important part of doing practice, and by visualizing yourself as a Buddha, that's how you became a Buddha. The other sort of faction is the sort of Subhatist faction in Indian Buddhism. Now, many people over the years, beginning with Giuseppe Tucci and so on and so forth, have tried to sort of show that sort of somehow Dzogchen teachings, much of which, of course, Padmasambhava is involved in, must have arisen from the the Buddhist encounter, the Tibetan encounter with Chan. But we can see very clearly in Manjushri Kirti's text that he names a number of people, and among them are Sri Singha under the name of Palgi Senge, and also the nun that in Zonglingma becomes Guru Rinpoche's guru, that is the Bhikshuni Galmo or Nandi. And so, in this particular text, we see in the 11th century, Manjushri Kirti identifying a sort of a Subhatist group of practitioners who argue that only the completion stage is important, that the creation stage is not important at all. And the most important thing is to just sort of rest in a state free of conceptual proliferation. So all of this taken together, we can see that if we look at the materials we have in the Tenjur and Kenjur, we can find that Padmasambhava's place, if you will, among the Indian Mahāsiddhas, generally speaking, is restricted in India to this idea that he was this sort of bhikshu like Buddhanyana who had a consort, and that he went to tame the Rakshasas in the southwest. I mean, that's all Vajrasana says about him. There's no information about Guru Rinpoche in Abhayadatta Shri's 84 Mahāsiddhas, and there's also no mention of him in the Charya Giti and Munidatta's commentary on that. So this is interesting that there's just this one small reference to Guru Rinpoche in this Vajrasana supplication, which we can clearly identify as being the person we know as Padmasambhava. The question comes, is the Padmakāra mentioned by Vajrasana actually the same person as Padmasambhava? And this, I think we have to have some doubt about this, because from the old Tibetan chronicles, all we really know about Padmasambhava there, I mean, of course, scholars know this, but maybe ordinary people don't know this. Padmasambhava is basically invited to Samye to improve the irrigation system. And someone, and I forget who it was, theorized this is because in Gilgit and Swat, they had need for sophisticated irrigation systems and terracing and so on and so forth. And so King Trisang Detsen wanted to have this sort of technology available to him. Then we have some information about Padmasambhava in the Bhaje, which is a sort of an annal written by one clan that was kind of opposed to the Chinese. There's some pro-Indian clan, which we have the notion of the so-called Samye debates between Kamalashila and Hashang Mahayana. And then we have really the next main source we have for Padmasambhava's life is this Bumnak Vajrakalaya commentary, which seems to be a 12th century text, maybe could be a little earlier, who knows, which gives these two contradictory accounts of Guru Rinpoche's life story. And then after that, it's all Terma. So we can know this because, for example, Yeshe, who is a really fantastic historian, from a Tibetan point of view, very, very, very careful scholar, wrote many 40 volumes of collected works, wrote many, many histories of Mahākala, Chakrasamvara, Rahavajra, Guhya Samaj, etc. He chooses to follow the Nyingma biography and the 7-chapter prayer, which was a term of Riggs and Godem, sort of. And so we see that we have a great deal of interesting resources to draw upon. And finally, I just want to add that in terms of this story of Saro Rahavajra, which seems to have been sort of started out as an independent story and then wrapped into the Padmasambhava narrative and mythos, Jamgon Kongtrul very clearly identifies Padmavajra, who is that is Saro Rahavajra. Padmavajra and Saro Rahavajra are the same person, except for there's a Padmavajra 1 and a Padmavajra 2, of course. That's why in Vajrasana Pad's supplication, he has 3 figures that we encounter. It's a Padmavajra, Saro Rahavajra, and Padmakāra. Jamgon Kongtrul in his Terten Gyatso, his 100 Tertens, he positively identifies Guru Rinpoche with Padmavajra, that is Saro Rahavajra, in this particular account. And oftentimes we hear Sakya masters say that Yangdak Haruka, Yangdak is just a nickname, by the way, it's this Sam Siddhi Sadhana, written by Humkara. And the actual name of the deity is Sri Haruka, not Yangdak is just the name of the sadhana. So Sri Haruka is kind of a generic term. So therefore they had to distinguish the Sri Haruka of the Sam Siddhi sadhana from the Sri Haruka of every other tantric cycle. Anyway, Yangdak Haruka is very frequently identified with Rahavajra, principally because the retinue of consorts of Yangdak Haruka and Rahavajra are identical. The mantras are completely different. The mantra for the Yangdak Haruka comes from the Sarva Buddhism Yoga Tantra, which was the kind of early sort of Chakrasamvara cycle Tantra. But apart from that, so people think, and when I received first the Rahavajra Tantra the Rahavajra empowerment from His Holiness, he very clearly said that, in his estimation, Yangdak Haruka and Rahavajra were the same deity. And we even have, for example, Dujam Rinpoche accusing the Sakyapas of stealing Lamdre from the intimate instructions that were associated with Yangdak Haruka, although I have not been able to verify personally this accusation. But you can find it in Dujam Rinpoche's famous Big Red Book. Anyway, so when we consider Padmasambhava among Indian Mahāsiddhas, we have a great deal of information, sources that we can see that maybe Tibetans worked with in constructing their narrative of Padmasambhava. But in terms of actually what we actually know about Padmasambhava among Indian Mahāsiddhas, we only just have one 4-line verse that only has 2 pieces of information. And so I don't really have anything more to add other than that, but I guess I will turn it over to the next person.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. And our next speaker is Charles Ramble, Professor Charles Ramble, who was actually my PhD supervisor, believe it or not. He succeeded in getting me through a PhD, quite an accomplishment. So Charles, please bear in mind we have simultaneous translation going on. So let's try to keep it well paced for him. So thank you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Jamyang. Let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay, that should be visible to everyone now, is it? Good. So I have to preface my presentation by saying I'm really not an expert on Padmasambhava, either in his Buddhist or his Bonpo manifestations. I encounter him periodically in Bonpo works, and there is a certain tradition according to which he is regarded as a Bonpo saint. This is a particular branch of Pön called Pön Sarma, the new Pön, which is something of a synthesis, a syncretic association between Buddhism and Pön that has been evolving in rather complicated ways over the centuries, and may, it has been argued, have been a predecessor to the ecumenical movement that developed in Eastern Tibet, the Jime movement that developed in Eastern Tibet in the 19th century. And this has certainly been going on a lot longer. So Padmasambhava is a particularly interesting figure. And what I would like to do is to present two Bonpo versions of him today. One, more in line with what you might imagine, that is to say, someone who was instrumental in displacing the Bonpos from Tibet in the 8th century, and the other one, this more syncretic version, in which he's given a rather important position. So just before everybody was allowed into the virtual room, Jeff very kindly sent me this image of the Bonpo Padmasambhava. I'll be telling you more about his name shortly. And I'm delighted because until now I hadn't actually seen an image of him. So this is quite a treat. He doesn't have the kinds of features that you would normally associate with Padmasambhava, but he does have this doje in his hand, and there's a little inscription below that calls him Wangden Pema, which would be the powerful lotus something. So the two traditions in question, the first one I'm going to read you extracts from. What I'm going to do is to talk you through the way he's represented in one text, probably from the 13th century, and in the other one I'm going to take you through a short biography of him. So the first version I would like to present to you appears in this text called the Dakpa Lingdak. Most of my slides are going to consist of names. I'll be using quite a lot of terms, so this way you'll be able to see them. This is a particularly interesting text that has never been published in translation. It is currently being worked on by Per Kverner, whose name you see here, Norwegian scholar. And he and Dan Martin will be publishing it probably later this year. Per Kverner has been working on it for the best part of 20 or 30 years, I think, if not longer. And now it's going to be substantially annotated and brought out. So this is a Bonpo version of the history of Tibet, focused around the events of the 8th century. And Padmasambhava appears in this. The other, no, I'll mention the other one later on. Okay, so let me read you some excerpts from this translation. As I say, it's not translated yet, it's not published yet. Per Kverner has very kindly shared his draft translation with me, and I've made a few excerpts over here. So we begin at chapter 58 of this text. During the time of Tisong Detsen. And it says that Che, that is to say Buddhism, again appeared in Tibet, having first been introduced during the time of Songtsen Gampo. And we are told that it happened due to the force of the acts of the three beggars. And we are told that long ago in the land of India, three beggars went begging, and thereby obtaining food and riches in abundance. And for the sake of future lives, they built a stupa called Ribo Jari Kashor, which is clearly a reference to Jarum Kashor, the great 7th century stupa in Kathmandu, in Bodha. It became famous, and when everything was completed, except for certain elements, notably the harmika and a few other things, the three of them were very old now, and they'd run out of food and riches, and so instead of completing the stupa, they concentrated on their afterlife. Now, at that time, the king of India said, "As for the king of Tibet, his power touches the sky. All these kings of the borders have been subdued by him." And the king of India sent two messengers to the king of China, saying, "The three of us, India, China, and Tazik," that is generically Persia, somewhere in Central Asia, "since this king of Tibet is harming us," remember that the Tibetan Empire was in full expansion at this time, "the time has now come for a means of subduing him." The king of China said, "The king of India is right. While we and the other kings have been made lords of men by the help of men, he, the king of Tibet, is one who has been made lord of men by the gods. The king of Tibet is great in power, the ministers are great in counsel, and the Bonpos are great in magic power. Therefore, he cannot be overcome by us. So as a means of overcoming the king of Tibet now, Che, Buddhism, the Dharma, must be introduced into Tibet. But who can do it?" Then the three old men who had built the stupa said, "We can do it." And the three of them went to the foot of the stupa and they offered flowers. And one said, "May I be reborn as a bodhisattva translator, spreading the Dharma in Tibet." And one said, "May I be reborn, endowed with magic power and the blessing of the Dharma." And the third one said, "May I, when you too have been reborn in this way, be reborn as a mighty lay patron king." And so by the power of that prayer, one of them was born, the last of them was born as Tisong Detsen, one as Bodhisattva, that is to say Shantirakshita, and one of them as Pema Jumne, Padmasambhava. And for the three of them thus taking counsel together, and Pen subsequently being suppressed by the king who went on to favor Buddhism, due to the force of the acts of the prayers of the former lives of these three beggars, this is how it came about. So it gives a not particularly salubrious perspective on the origins of this trio who were significant, who were particularly responsible for the suppression of Pen in the 8th century, according to the Bonpo account. Now we move to chapter 63 of this account, the coming of Padmasambhava to Tibet. Now we have a very important figure here called Dempa Namka, who is a priest of the king. We'll be seeing quite a bit more of Dempa Namka soon. So Dempa Namka had had a dream, and just as he had dreamt, Padmasambhava and Shantirakshita came to Tibet. And they spoke to Tisong Detsen about the virtue of the Indian Dharma, and they said, "Now you must abandon this Pen and practice the Indian Dharma." And so the king delighted in practicing Dharma because of the prayer of the power of the acts of the three beggars in former lives. Now, the ministers, this is in chapter 65, they try to dissuade the king from practicing the Dharma. And one of the ministers, who is a maternal uncle of the young king, it's called Mashang Tompake, he respectfully said, "Oh, king," well, he's basically saying that this is really inappropriate for the people of Tibet to adopt Buddhism. And he says, a bird that adopts the way of the fish drowns and dies. A fish that adopts the way of the bird dies of thirst. A yak from the highlands, deep in the north, that is banished to the hot gorges in the south, its heart will burst. If a donkey from the three lands of Men, that's in the south, is taken to the highlands, deep in the north, its brain will freeze and it will die. So he's saying that for a Tibetan to adopt this alien language of India, or this alien religion of India, is something highly dangerous. And he goes on to say that Padmasambhava does not shun the impurity of singeing the hearth. Now, this is a type of pollution called shop in Tibetan. If your food overflows onto the stove, it offends the gods of the house. Nor does he shun the pollution of murder or incest. So he's not being presented in a very positive light here. Hence, the Lord's mighty Gurla, these are his private gods, will be offended. And it is certain that if you adopt Buddhism, the realm of Tibet will be ruined. And I respectfully request you not to practice the Indian Dharma. So the people mobilize against Padmasambhava. And then because of this, it says the king had second thoughts. And after, to cut a long story short, a law was proclaimed that the Dharma was not to be practiced. Padmasambhava and Bodhisattva, unable to put up with the revilings, the criticisms of the ordinary people of Tibet, returned to India. Chapter 72. But again, the divine son, Tisong Detsen, through the power of the acts of these three beggars in their former lives, intended to practice the holy Dharma. And so he invited Bodhisattva and Padmasambhava from India, saying, since I shall practice the Dharma, you should stay, and I shall construct temples. Chapter 73, it begins with this very nice statement, the king's ears being softer than silk, and the monk's lips being sharper than chisels. When the two of these came into contact, the king, his mind was corrupted, and he imposed a tax on the inhabitants of Tibet. He built 12 Dharma temples and 108 shrines and 108 stupas. Then the mighty Tisong Detsen himself, Padmasambhava and Bodhisattva, those three, they made the plans and they built the temple of Samye and caused the Dharma to flourish. And then there's a contest of magic between the Buddhists and the Bonpos, and Padmasambhava is representing the Buddhists. The king Tisong Detsen gathered all the monks and the Bonpos, and he said, you must compete to see whether Dharma or Pön is great and true with regard to magic power and blessings. And so the king says, if, as Pön and Dharma have to compete in magic, if you, Bonpo, have magic power, kill this representative of the Dharma, Shakyadawa. Moreover, you must manifest many wonderful signs of magic power. And you, Padma, and the monks must prevent Shakyadawa from dying. And you must also manifest many wonderful signs of magic power. And then Padmasambhava performed the averting and life-grasping rituals. But as the Bonpo, who were powerful in magic, performed their magic, Shakyadawa quickly died. And the king said to Padmasambhava, how did it happen that Shakyadawa died? And Padmasambhava replied, oh, he had no further span of life. His life had run out, and it was his time to die. And the king said, if you, Bonpo, have great magic power, revive Shakyadawa so that he is no longer dead. And the Bonpos performed the rituals of stopping the demons and of averting them from the path, breaking the tally stick of the Lord of Death and making an exchange with the gods and the demons. The tally stick of the Lord of Death was broken, the demons were stopped and averted from the path, and Shakyadawa was brought back to life. And now the the next test comes along in the next chapter. The king says, "Oh, Padma, if your Che, your Dharma, has magic power, kill by means of magic this representative of the Bonpo, Nanam Mashang. You Bonpos must prevent him from dying." Then the Bonpo, Penegu, grasped the good fortune of life of Mashang. And although Padmasambhava brought the life heart of the gods and demons and performed fearful rituals, he could not even make the uncle Mashang fall asleep, let alone die. Thus, the Bonpo were greater in skill of magic power. But anyway, in the long run, of course, the king's mind is perverted by these wicked Buddhists, and the Bon religion is suppressed. So that is one version of Padmasambhava, which appears in this very early historical account, the Drakpa Lingjak, probably, as I say, 13th century. Now we leave that aside, and we turn to an alternative tradition, which has been discussed in this and certain other works by Anne-Marie Blondeau, former professor of Tibetan Buddhism or Tibetan religions in Paris. So this is an article published in 1985, Kensei Wangpo, The Life of Padmasambhava According to the Tradition of Drakpa Pen and Its Sources. Now, this is a biography of Padmasambhava that is found in the Rinchen Terzo, which is an important compilation of mainly Nyingma termas, compiled by Kongtul Lodotaye. So these are the dates. The biography itself is by Kensei Wangpo, and it's in the 63rd volume of the Rinchen Terzo. Now, volume 1 of the Rinchen Terzo contains biographies of Padmasambhava because he is the master of the teachings contained in this collection. Now, this Bonpo version is analogous to the others. It precedes a small collection of, there's just 10 texts on Bonpo rituals in volume 63. And this biography is a short text in just 9 folios and 11 short chapters. And I'm going to take you through the chapters. So here we have the title here, A Brief Account of Guru Pema Jungne, the son of the Jina, presented according to the Drakpa Pen tradition, Drakpa Pen look. So chapter 1 concerns the birth of the father, the great Lama Dempa Namka. So here is Dempa Namka. This is Dempa Namka. He's a very important figure for the Bonpos. In Buddhist sources, notably in the Katang literature, such as the Gyalpo Katang, the Pema Katang, and so forth, he is a translator whom the Emperor Tisong Detsen summons to translate Buddhist and Bonpo texts. And when the Pon religion is banned, he converts to Buddhism. He receives royal permission to conceal Bonpo texts inside a black stupa in Samye. And these will be the future Bonpo Terma. He then becomes one of the 25 disciples of Padmasambhava. Now, among the Bonpos, his significance is much greater. He is sometimes classed among the Lopan Shen. Shen is a Bonpo term meaning a priest, and Lo translator, Pandita scholar. He also features among the Tumigu, the 9 powerful men. He was already said to have been alive during the time of the second king, Muti Tsempo, who is the son of Nyati Tsempo. And during the first persecution of Pön by the 8th emperor, Digum Tsempo, he concealed Bon texts, and he counseled the son of Digum Tsempo to restore the Bon religion. As Samten Karmi says, this seems to be a conflation of two, well, it's one persecution of Pön that has been placed in two completely different periods. Yeah. So anyway, this is the Bonpo version. There are two persecutions, one in the early time and one later on in the 8th century. But because he had obtained the Siddhi of long life, he lived long enough to be present for the second persecution. And when he converted to Buddhism, he actually only pretended to convert, maintaining that Pön and Buddhism were different only from the perspective of relative truth. And he conceals texts that will be discovered by the reincarnations of contemporary disciples. So he actually holds very much a similar place in Pön to the one that Padmasambhava holds in Buddhism. He's regarded as being a manifestation of Kuntu Zangpo. Anyway, so in this biography of Padmasambhava in chapter 1, I've put these names up, the ones that I'm going to be talking about. So how does it start? We have some very Bonpo themes. It takes place in the palace of Kyunglung Ngulkar, which is regarded as being the capital of Shangjung. In the city of Gyalwan Nyepa. And then there are a couple, a king called Gyungyar Mukherjee and his queen, Chatsun Gongma. And they excuse me, they couldn't have a son. They desperately wanted a son. So they made an offering of an elephant loaded with gold dust to the 8 Lopan. These are the 4 Tibetan translators and 4 masters from Shangjung. And then Kuntu Zangpo emitted a ray of light with the letter A that dissolved into the body of the mother. And she gave birth to a pure child who bore the greater and lesser signs of a Buddha. His body was the color of luminous space. He had 3 eyes of wisdom, and on his heart there was the mark of an 8-petaled lotus. He could see all the peaceful and wrathful Yidams, and he subjugated all living beings. He traveled vastly. All the Dakinis brought him food. The wild beasts circumambulated him. He knew his 500 former births, and consequently, he was called Dempa, which means recollection, Namka, as vast as the sky. Okay, so that's the etymology of his name. And he is regarded as being the greatest Vidyadhara knowledge holder who ever lived. In chapter 2, we're still on Dempa Namka. And because he was fully realized, he didn't need to study, but in order to set an example to others, he joined the school of the 8 great scholars of Shangjung and Tibet. It's not quite clear who is meant by this in the text. There is a list of 9, but it seems to be different. He was the disciple of 9 Indian scholars who are not identified, and he developed all domains of knowledge: grammar, logic, discussion, disputation, and so on. He went to Tazik, Central Asia, from where he received teachings from Shen Namka Nangwa Dzogchen, and he mastered magical powers. He learned the Siddhis from other masters. He learned 21 languages. He frequented the cemeteries of Odhyana, and he bound the Hlasin, the terrestrial gods, with oaths, and he became their chief. And in southwest Shangjung, he debated with 500 heretical masters and defeated them, and he converted them to the doctrine of Buddha. And he received the name Gyerpong Mawe Sengye. So we get to chapter 3, and here we have the birth of his 2 sons. So he recollected a vow from his former life, and this was a vow to diffuse the doctrine and to crush the Rakshasas, the demons of the southwest. And he goes to India, and here he takes a consort, Nyingma Ningpo Obarma, who is the daughter of a Brahmin, and she gives birth to 2 sons. The elder one, Yungdung Dönsel, was as clear as crystal, and he has a swastika in the middle of his forehead. He knew this present life and all his future lives, and he lived mainly in solitary retreat. So this Yungdung Tensel is a very spiritual, very obscure figure. In some texts, he's actually just a manifestation of Denpa Namkha, the one who is sometimes his father. There is a great deal of literature dedicated to him, which I won't be talking about. But since that literature, some of it does mention his younger brother, with whom we are concerned here, I'll talk about certain aspects of it. So this is Yungdung Tensel, who also acquires the siddhi of long life, and he therefore has the name Tsewang, long life, Rinzin, knowledge holder. Okay, so here you can see him in his different forms. This is courtesy of Har, H-A-R, thanks to Jeff. These are all manifestations of him. He's something of a shapeshifter. Here at the center, he's with his consort, but when he visits different sacred sites, he has different colors, he has different forms, he does different things. So here, for example, I'll just give you one or two examples. While he's at Mount Kailash, he was white in color and he rode a rainbow. He had silk ribbons in his hair and he wore jeweled earrings while adopting a dance posture and playing melodies on a lute. He was surrounded by fearsome Dakinis, daughters of the gods. He subjugated the gods. And then we have another one. So he's riding on a sunbeam in another location. Here he is riding a Garuda. Here he's riding the lightning. And just today I received from Jeff a tanka from which I showed you a detail earlier on. And this is, I'm not sure because I can't read the inscriptions, but I suspect that the one at the center might be Denpa Namkha. I'm not sure. And the one down to the bottom left could be Tsewang Rinzin, and the one to the right is the one we are mainly concerned with. So we now come to this, this other brother. The younger one was magnificent with a dark brown face. He had bulging eyes, his nose was wrinkled in anger, he had a gaping triangular mouth, and both his hands were making mudras of destruction, and his feet were in a dance posture. And his father named him Pema Tongdol. Pema Tongdol. Actually, Pema Tongdol now in the Buddhist tradition, I think it is only in the context of Padmasambhava, it's only used to refer to the great tanka that represents the 8 aspects of Padmasambhava that is unfurled once a year in Bhutan. Anyway, so this is the name of the Bonpo version of Padmasambhava. And this is the figure here on the right. In some texts, he's referred to as Yungdung Tongdol, a much more Bonpo name. Okay, we then go to chapter 4, and we have the mother and the 2 sons obtaining the siddhas. So the mother, Yungdung Tensel, this is the older, more spiritual son, practices the cycle of the Chipung. The Chipung, it's a triad of wrathful yidams in the Bon tradition, and he practices the cycle of the Ringzins, the Vidyadharas, and he attained realization and the siddhi of long life, hence his name, Tsewang Ringzin. The younger brother, Pema Tongdol, he received the excellent initiation of the 13 magical powers and the destructive magical rites. So you can see he's altogether a much fiercer kind of character. And he practiced these in the great cemetery of Nerjin Tröpa in the West and attained all the signs of realization. The mother practiced the meditation of Gekhe Sangwa in a cave called, well, don't worry about the cave. So Gekhe is another of these extremely important divinities, not one of this group of 3, the 3 Chipung, but he does form one of the 3, what are called the Stekhars, the divine citadels of which the three Chipung, the embodiment, universal embodiment, form a part. Let's go back to what they were practicing. So she wants to acquire further powers, and she wants to go to a place called Mingyurtsal in India. Now it starts to become rather familiar from the biographies of the Buddhist Padmasambhava, because here a 7 times born Brahmin called Nobu is cutting his body into 7 pieces for the benefit of others. But when she gets there, it turns out that because Dempa Namka had not been doing his meditation properly, another Dakini of the southwest, someone called Ngunzok Yingchukma, had purloined, had taken away all these relics, and all she got was 1 hair. So she was furious. And when she gets back, she tells Dempa Namka, first, because of my karma, I obtained a female body. Then I met you, which was the result of good karma, but now, because of my impure karmic traces, I did not achieve my aims. And she's furious, and she wants to leave with her 2 sons. And the father says he wants to keep the sons, so there's a marital dispute between them, but the sons sort it out. They make an arrangement between themselves that the older son will stay with the father, and the younger one will go with the mother. And they make a vow, so they separate, they make a vow to meet in this life and the next, and the mother and Pema Tongdo set off for India. They arrive at this place, Kunga Metok Zepeling. The mother wants to go to her Gana Chakra, there's another one happening, and she hides her son in a lotus. Okay, yeah, I've got a message here saying this is Dempa Yabse Sung, so this is Dempa Namka and his twin sons. Yeah. So the mother hides her son in a lotus, and she goes off to take part in her Gana Chakra in Uddiyana. So she does get the relics this time. She eats the body. She becomes the chief of the Dakinis of the local of the Lotus family. In the meantime, in the city of Rinchen-Drup, in chapter 5, in the capital, this is the capital of southern India, there is a virtuous king who is called Kuntu Ge, all virtuous. His queen is named Nangwa Udenma. They badly want a son, but they can't have one. So they pray to the 3 jewels, and they got a huge accumulation of virtue. And a Brahmin, someone calls Yeshe, says to them, great king, you have collected merit. Now listen, to assure your succession, tomorrow you and all your entourage should go to Kunza Metok Zepeling, and the queen will surely find a son whom she can share. So the next day, there's an auspicious configuration of stars and planets. They go to the park, make prayers, make offerings to the Buddhas, and the king and queen notice a movement inside a flower, and they see a boy who is covered in auspicious signs. He has a red and white complexion, bulging eyes, wrinkly nose, triangular gaping mouth, hands making destructive, anyway, it's him. So they gather him up and take him to Rinchen-Drup. Interestingly, some aspects of this are less similar to the biographies of Padmasambhava in the Buddhist tradition than they are to the Manikabum, the life of Avalokiteshvara, when he is found by a king called Zanko Chok, who has no son. Anyway, back at the palace in chapter 6, the king of the south enthrones him. He summons his court, distributes rich gifts. A Brahmin comes to examine the child for signs and says he's very auspicious because he has the signs of a Buddha generally, but specifically because of his red and white color, which means that he will subjugate the Hla and the Day, the gods and the demons of the phenomenal world. The wrinkles on his nose means that he will crush the armies of the Rakshasas, and his triangular mouth means that he will be the chief of the Mamos and the Dakinis. And he was called Red Mouth, Kamar, and he was duly enthroned as the successor of the king. In the 7th chapter, he demonstrates his magical powers by flinging a stone with his sling. He hits the minister's son in the head, in the head and kills him. The king then offers to pay compensation. Now you recognize this story from parallel accounts. Pay compensation from all his jewels, but the ministers want punishment, and they throw him into a lake of poison. He survives. They throw him off the top of a poisoned mountain, but nothing happens. And they throw him into a pit of poisonous man-eating snakes, but he survives that. Then they try to burn him in a fire of sandalwood oil. This is the story we just heard from Malcolm. But the oil forms a lake around him, and there he is, seated on a lotus. So everyone is convinced that he is a Buddha, and they prostrate to him, and he's given the name Pema Jomne. He then goes to visit his mother in chapter 8, where she's doing her Gana Chakra, and she tells him to go to the south. And in a place called Rinchen Barwedak, there are many doors, and he should remove the treasures and practice them. So he takes these out, he practices them extensively, and well, from inside the Bangso Sengi Namchok, he removes 5 boxes of profound treasures. So this is a summary of what's in there. I won't read them all out. So this basically corresponds to the Kagye in the Buddhist tradition. These are the 8 caskets of different materials that were removed from a stupa in the cemetery of Sitavana, Silwetsel. Anyway, because he was blessed by the lamas, the yidams and the dakinis, as soon as he looked at the books, he knew their meaning fully. So he achieved full realization and accomplished his deeds. Yeah, so following his mother's instructions, he goes to this place, Dukri Tupepuk, in the south, and he meditates on and realizes Vajrakilaya. And as a sign of his realization, he throws his purva at a rock, and the purva goes straight through. And anyway, he practices in various places, and in each place where he practices, he achieves even further powers. I won't enumerate those. And as a result of this, an infinitely large number of living beings are liberated. In chapter 10, he is of particularly great benefit for Tibet. He abides on the mountain of the 9 Nyen, these mountain gods, the Nyen, and he bound by oath all the Dekpa, the arrogant ones, this class of ferocious earthly demons. He subjugated the 100 Rudras. In the Buddhist tradition, Rudra just refers to a form of Mahadev, but it's a class of malefactors in Burma. And he blessed the 100 holy places for pilgrimage. And then he does his treasure concealing, that he hid an inconceivable number of treasures in mountains, rocks, and lakes. He left footprints and handprints. He practiced the secret tantras with the dakinis and practiced other secret rituals. And in the final chapter, he defeats the red-faced Rakshasas, because there's suddenly this superabundance of these demons, these red-faced demons. There are 100,000 billion of them, like an overflowing ocean that invade the southern continent, and they go around committing slaughter and rape. And what he does, he goes to their realm, he transfers the consciousness of their king and occupies his body, and then establishes the world in a state of peace. Okay, so like the Buddhist version, you can see that's the end of the story, basically. Like the Buddhist version, this one also combines the 2 traditions, the womb birth version and the miraculous birth in the lotus version. But of course, this version is completely different from the Buddhist one, to the extent that it establishes this connection with Dempa Namka, who is a very important figure for the Bonpos. It's clear that he is not the supreme figure in this triad. His role is mainly one of subjugation and ferocity. The main figures really are his father and Yungdung Tunsel, Tsewang Ringzin, who stays with his father and attains the highest Bodhi. So what were the sources for this? Anne-Marie Blondeau has done a wonderful piece of detective work by eliminating various texts. There's a rich tradition around Sewang Rinzin called Shangjungma, Puyulma, Gyakarma. The Shangjungma is missing, but there are elements of the story in that account, but she eliminates those. Those are 13th or 14th century works. And her conclusion, to cut a very long story short, is this, that Kensei's version, chapters 1 to 3, are taken from this work called the Lungten Kul de Chungwa. It is a terma that was discovered, sorry, I haven't given the phonetic form here, by the Bonpo treasure discoverer Martin Shidzin, who was born in 1092, and from another work called the Rigzin Rikte Tukyu, discovered by Martin Sherab Sengye. The 4th to 10th chapters are taken from the same work, this discovery by Martin Sherab Sengye, but that had by this time been developed later on by another scholar, Yilten Kyungwetzel, because it contains elements that cannot have been around at this time. Probably the earlier date is the right one for him, actually, 1175. It's not sure which cycle he was born in. And then the 11th century, the 11th last chapter, an unknown source. It's quite possible, Anne-Marie Blondeau proposes, that it was taken from a more complete version of the Lungten Kul de Chungwa that was available to Kensei, and that is not available to us. So her hypothesis is this, that this Bonpo account is based on a first discovery by Ma. The Ma family were very important in all this. Ma Sherab Sangye, who transmitted it to Yilten Kyungwetzel, who amplified it according to the Buddhist Katangs. Okay? But then, of course, the Buddhist Katangs contain a great deal of earlier Bonpo material. They contain material from the Zermig. So the lineage of the direction of transmission is by no means clear in all cases. Anyway, this tradition is referred to by the Bonpos as Drakpa Pen, the tradition of proclaimed Pen, and Anne-Marie Blondeau's concluding points are the following: that it is a tradition that is interior to Pen, that it is structured around Drempa Namka, it is syncretic, claiming that Pen and Buddhism are not distinct. It is based exclusively on Terma literature with a clear lineage of Tertons from the Ma families via Yilten Kunse Kyungwetzel down to much later treasure discoverers who are both Bonpos and Buddhists. As in the case of this figure, Dorje Lingpa, 14th century, the dates are uncertain here. The Bonpos put him earlier. But he has two names. He's called Penshik Yungdrung Lingpa or Dorje Lingpa because he discovered both Bonpo and Buddhist works. And the Bonpo works that he discovered include this cycle of Tsewang Rinzin, Buyulma, Gyakarma, Shangshungma. She points out that there are notable analogies with the Buddhist story of Padmasambhava as found in the Katang literature. But again, I repeat, that many of these katangs contain elements from early Bonpo sources. So there we are. I've gone on a little long. I'm so sorry, but I think, Jamini, you did give us 5 or 10 minute leeway. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charles. And our next speaker is Jeff Watt from Himalayan Art Resources. Highly recommended resource, which is absolutely fantastic. Jeff is one of the top experts, iconographers of Himalayan art in the world. And I've been actually trying to invite him for a long time. So I'm very happy that finally today I've succeeded. So thank you, Jeff. And Charles, I think you have to stop sharing your screen or we won't see Jeff somehow. Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Charles.
So thank you. So like some of the others on this panel, really Padmasambhava is not a main focus of mine, but it is important because of the art and the narratives, and it does matter in terms of understanding the art of Himalayan Tibetan Buddhism, and it is also a source of problems. But many things in Himalayan art and religion are problems. They're problems to be solved. Now, Padmasambhava is something that I find needs to be divided up into early period, very early period, historical early period, then the early art period, and then the later art period. So for the 8th, 9th, 10th century, 11th century, we have no art. What we have is we have really just the very, very brief mentions from the Dunhuang manuscripts and from some texts, very, very short. And we really don't have any material until we start getting into the 12th, 13th, 14th century, really with Nyangro Nyima Oser and Guru Chowang, and artistic material based on the writings of these two Nyingma teachers. Now, back to the 8th century, 9th century with the what we can say is sort of the original concept of Guru Rinpoche, of Padmasambhava. We can also look to the writings of Dudjom Rinpoche in the History of the Nyingma, where he writes, when Padmasambhava was invited to Samye, then he remained in Tibet for 3 years. And then after that period, then he became invisible and could only be seen by his 25 great disciples. So right away, that tells you there's a problem. There's a historical problem here. Because then we have Gelugpa history, and the Gelugpa history says, yes, but after that 3-year period, another guy came, possibly from Kashmir, claiming to be Padmasambhava, and he did a lot of very bad things in Tibet. So right away we have different stories about the origin of Padmasambhava and his legacy in Tibet. Now, this is not uncommon. We have this from India. It's already been touched on that we have several Indrabutis. We have the elder, middling, and the younger King Indrabuti. And why there's only 3 and not necessarily more, I don't know. We also have the same situation with Nagarjuna, where we have the Nagarjuna of the 1st, 2nd century, and then we have the Nagarjuna Garbha of the Vajrasana system of the 84 Mahāsiddhas, which has been discussed just a little bit. So we have multiple Indrabutis, we have multiple Nagarjunas. We have Nagarjuna also of the 35 Confession Buddhas, a text considered spurious by many. Then we also have Virupa, the Virupa of the Sakyalamdre system, where we have what's considered the main Virupa, who was stopped the sun in the sky and who was took initiation directly from Vajranairaitmya. And his students later promoted the Rahavajra system very strongly in Tibet, especially in the Sakya tradition. But then we also have the Virupa of the Shangpa Kagyu, and then we have the Virupa of the Rakta Yamari lineages that went into Tibet. And then we have the Virupa in the lineage of the Chinamasta Vajrayogini. So we have all of these different Virupas. And it was really a Tibetan Lama named Deshung Rinpoche, which first talked about that there are so many different Virupas, it's hard to keep them all clear. So now going back to Padmasambhava, so we have this idea that there might be some multiples of Padmasambhava, and we also have this in art. We have this in early painters of Tibet. We have multiple figures. We also have the multiple problem with Yutok Yuntangompo, Yutokyuntungompo the elder, Yutokyuntungompo the younger, and is one made up and one is real? Are they both real? We don't know. So this is a problem. Now, for art, with art, we really do not find images until the 13th century. And the first images are generally as secondary figures. And let me just try and bring one of those up. Now, here we have a mandala. I hope everybody can see it. And at the center is a wrathful deity, and then there's concentric circles moving outward. And then in your 11 o'clock position, there's a circle, and that contains Padmasambhava, and as representing the 5 symbolic Buddhas. So Vairochana, Amitabha, Akshobhya, Ratnasambhava, Amoghasiddhi. It's this Kurigna, the 5 families. But we also, if you follow that 11 o'clock line a little bit further up to the upper left corner, then we also have an image of Padmasambhava. As he's typically depicted, the hat is a little bit more of a Pandita hat, but his robes are those of a layperson. He's holding a Vajra. He's holding, I believe, a skull cup in his left hand, and Katvanga, a tantric staff, against his left shoulder. Now, this painting is really the earliest I have found. And I've not done a tremendous amount of research on the tantric subject, but I believe it to be a Nyingma Structure text. And it's very possible that in the bottom right corner is Nyingma Structure himself. So this is a kind of material we're dealing with in the 13th and 14th century. We're dealing with Padmasambhava as a secondary figure. Now, we also have other paintings such as Avalokiteshvara. Now, with this painting, if you look to your roughly, if you take the center of the chest of Avalokiteshvara, and then you look at the 7 o'clock position, you will see a red Avalokiteshvara with a Hayagriva to one side and Jnana Dakini or Guya Dakini to his left. But directly above the red four-armed Avalokiteshvara, again, is a Padmasambhava figure. So here we have again a 14th century painting, and we're beginning to see Padmasambhava being included in the art. We're beginning to see him sometimes lower down in the composition, sometimes he can be at the top, depending, but there's very little art. It starts off with these secondary images, and then by the 15th century, we really start moving into having Padmasambhava as a central figure, and it's a standardized appearance. It's really what you think of as Padmasambhava with the lotus hat, with the holding of Vajra to his heart or slightly to the side, a Vajra scepter, skull cup and long life vase in the lap, and the Katvanga staff, and layers and layers of clothes, along with wearing felt boots. And on the crown of the head, on the crown of the hat, is a single vulture feather. So this is a standard kind of look. We can get a little bit different types of hats and a slightly different choice of colors for clothing, but this is really what we're seeing coming down from the 13th century up until the present. Now, with some of these early paintings, they're not necessarily Nyingma. lot of the paintings are actually Kagyu. And how we know this is because they have Kagyu deities mixed, or they will have some Kagyu teachers who are recognizable, such as Black Hat Karmapa, or such as a Dri Kumara Taklung, recognized by their hats. So some of this early Padmasambhava material and some of this early Nyangro Nyima Oser text describing Padmasambhava, or Guru Chowang describing Padmasambhava, and the meditation practices are being included in a lot of Kagyu paintings. Of all the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, we have the four that are commonly talked about: the Nyingma, Sakya Kagyu, Gelug. This is a very artificial kind of system developed by the government of the fifth Dalai Lama in the 17th century, and it's a very much a Gelugpa system to try and understand how to control the different political groups of Tibet. But if you look at the different traditions of Tibet, the practices of Padmasambhava, the appearance of Padmasambhava and the Terma is all new. It's all coming after Nyangro Nyima Oser and Guru Chowang. So it's actually late. So in a way, you can say that the emphasis on Padmasambhava and the Nyingma tradition is not the Nyingma old school. It's actually the newest of the schools of Tibet. All of the new termas that especially came about in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, these are all new. So this kind of Padmasambhava focused Nyingma is in fact the newest school of Tibet, and not necessarily the old school relying on the old Dzogchen tantras and the Guyagarbha tantra and the other tantras that are truly ancient. So with Nyingma, we have very little material to look at, and we have to really talk about how we have have early art, we have this middle and late art, and it goes back to one source. And that's the source of Nyangro Nyima Oser, which was then copied by Guru Chowang. It is these two very early tertons that describe the form of Padmasambhava, describe the 8 manifestations and how they appear, and especially describe the copper-colored mountain of Padmasambhava. It's from that period. It's from that 12th, 13th century period. So in art, in terms of what are the main subjects, especially for the later art. So really what we begin to see Padmasambhava as a central figure in the 15th century, and then that carries on, of course, to the present. But what we really see is Padmasambhava and his 2 main female consorts. We see Mandarava and Yeshe Tsogyal. This is the first theme. The second theme is really with the 8 forms, and the 8 forms are really representing important events in the life of Padmasambhava. So they're markers. Not all of them have been transformed into meditation or guru yoga practices. Probably the main one is the Dorje Drolo practice. Now, after the 8 forms, then we get the 25 disciples, with Guru Rinpoche at the center of a composition, and then the 25 main disciples. Now, the 25 disciples, there's different systems. There's not one system and everybody accepts it, and textually that's the one that you can trace back through the centuries. And it's like, no, there's different systems of who the main 25 disciples are. In terms of the 8 forms of Padmasambhava, there's also more than 8 forms, depending on the system of Terma you're looking at, because there's 12 months of the year, and it's very nice to be able to have a special form of Padmasambhava and a special life event in each of these months. So there are other systems of 8, 12, 16 forms of Padmasambhava. Now, another main theme that you find is the copper-colored mountain. Copper-colored mountain is based on these early descriptions by these early Tertons and subsequent Tertons, even up until a present time. As a matter of fact, a very famous description of the copper-colored mountain was recorded by Terdok Lingpa in the 19th century after he had a dream. So after he had a dream of this, then it was, and what he did, he actually, in the dream, he went to the copper-colored mountain. Once he woke up, he had, or he himself, or he had somebody, depending on what biography you trust with this Terdok Lingpa, with this teacher, then you actually see his route, who he met, what he did. It's all described, and then a painting was made. So we have a living tradition that's right up to the present time of making paintings of the copper-colored mountain with variations. Now, another theme we find in painting is the field of accumulation, the Dzogchen, and this is really based on the Longchen Nintig of Jigme Lingpa, where we begin to have real Nyingma refuge fields. So in this, we have Guru Rinpoche at the center, and then his students and various deities, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, surrounding the image. Now, these are the most important, the main themes, the main subjects of art for Padmasambhava. So we have Padmasambhava, his consorts, Padmasambhava, 8 forms, Padmasambhava, 25 disciples, Padmasambhava, copper-colored mountain, Padmasambhava, field of accumulation. But then in the last 200 years, 300 years, we have a tremendous burst of paintings that are based on revealed treasure. And the revealed treasure goes back to Padmasambhava. In terms of the lineage, the treasure is discovered in the 17th century, 18th, 19th, 20th, but it's claimed to go back to Padmasambhava. So we have a tremendous amount of new forms of Padmasambhava appearing, where he's standing, where he's sitting, where he's flying. We have Padmasambhava where he's holding the Vajra to the side, he's holding the Vajra scepter in the right hand across the right knee, he's holding the Vajra scepter at the heart, he's holding the Vajra scepter upraised as if he is going to throw it. All of these different forms of Padmasambhava are all given names. So we have all of these different types of new terma and new images of Padmasambhava, all with names that must be recorded and recognized. So it becomes really quite complicated. It becomes complicated because also with the Nyingma system, be it the ancient Nyingma system or the new Nyingma system of Terma since 12th, 13th century, Nyingma is an anarchic system. It does not have any central hierarchy. There are no bosses. There's no central boss. There's no central location, and there are lineages. Originally, there were you can say there were at least 25 lineages of Nyingma coming from the 25 main disciples. But then there are many more, with many more Tertons discovering revealed treasure and new teachings and new descriptions of Padmasambhava and his different peaceful and wrathful appearances to be used in meditation. So we have this this real proliferation of forms, but we have no central body to organize and label and divide and structure them in some manner that might be easy to follow and understand, and to give it some hierarchy, because there is no hierarchy. They're all individually absolutely equal. So this creates a problem for understanding the art. It creates a problem in being able to learn the subject in an easy, organized fashion. So this is one of the reasons Padmasambhava isn't one of my main areas of study. It's because it's difficult. It's just really difficult. You have to study too many texts. There's too many variations. So I try and follow the art. And by following the early examples, by following basically the secondary figures in the early paintings, and then following and noticing what deities or what lineage teachers those are associated with, and then moving more to the present and following, then we can get a sense of what is going on with the art and with some of the different teachings and practices. So from the 13th century up until the 15th and 16th century, the Terma was very much associated with other traditions and lineages. So you can easily have a Kagyu teacher of the Drikung or Drukpa or Kamsangpa, the Karma Kagyu, also practicing some Terma, practicing some types of Nyingma tradition, which was easy to do because it's not a moving away from one's own tradition, because Nyingma has no hierarchy. It has no central body of authority. So it's easy to pick up different teachings, practices, and techniques, and then to absorb them into your own practice. You don't have to claim that it's Karma Kagyu or Drikung or Jonang or Sakya. You can just say, oh, it's just a Nyingma Terma practice that you've adopted. So we see this quite clearly in the paintings, the early paintings. And it's not until really the 17th century we see the Nyingma compositions where they're very strongly, very heavily just Nyingma in orientation. So this is a subject that has to be looked at carefully with both text and painting. It is not a direct line. With the other traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, the Sakya, the Jonang, and then the different breaks, the Shangpa Kagyu, and then the different breaks into the Chaksam and the different branches, there's lines to follow. It's a little bit like a river. There you can follow it, but the Nyingma is more like it's more like 100 or 1,000 small streams, and some streams are basically unrelated to others but similar in content, but their origins are completely unrelated, and the teachers don't know each other. So it's a difficult subject from the point of view of trying to get a really good handle and a good overview on all of it, because it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work at all that way. You have to look individually at all of the different parts to understand. You can't superimpose an understanding from a terma and understanding of a painting of a Nyingma Padmasambhava subject and then superimpose it on another system of terma from a different tertan at a different time period. Yes, you can find similarities, but you cannot assume that there are relationships. So I think I'll leave it at that. It's a complicated subject. I've struggled with it for years and struggled with the imagery. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much for also helping us understand how complicated it is. And so we hope to invite you back to further elucidate and think about the topics. And next we have Fabian Sanders. Professor Fabian Sanders was actually the academic director of Shanshun, UK. Sorry about the echo. And he's our last speaker. And so in about half an hour, we'll have a brief roundtable. So if you have any questions, please keep them for after. And thank you, Fabian. And here you are.
Thank you very much. Mi sa che devi mutare il tuo. Devi mutare.
Ho mutato questo, va bene?
Sì. Okay, sorry for the slight technical inconvenience. And thank you very much, Jamyang, for organizing this meeting. Very interesting. Actually, I'm not really, you know, I'm a bit kind of an outsider here, as you will see. And when Jamyang invited me to talk about Padmasambhava, I first thought, I think I have already said everything I know about Padmasambhava, probably even more than that. He has organized a conference in London some years ago. But then I thought maybe the topic that I would be interested to hear about is the relationship between Padmasambhava and Tibetan, because of course there is a lot of material and thoughts and things that might be said at that in this regard. And of course, when then I proposed this topic and I went to do some, and he accepted, and I went to do some research, I thought, oh, this is really too much. It's a very, very, very complicated topic. And I think what Jeff said up to this point also, I mean, I confirmed that when you start looking into these things in texts and so on and so forth, documents, and also, you know, the living tradition as transmitted by the masters and so forth, it really is an enormous topic. So basically, I would like to shortly, because we are beyond time, in any case, shortly introduce a few ideas that actually were the cause for me to propose this topic. And I have more questions than solutions. And I will be trying to talk from the perspective of the tradition as it has been received, at least, of course, what I've heard or read from Tibetan masters these days, not looking necessarily at the historical evolutions and so forth. So my basic interest was to understand how it is possible to transfer a sacrality, a basic sacrality of a language from one into another, not only to translate the topics, the contents, the teachings that are represented in one language, but also to transfer its sacredness, its intrinsic power, let's say. We could say that in India, at least, when Sanskrit is concerned, there are two levels, I would say, of sacredness of language. Of course, the topic of sacredness of Sanskrit is very large, and this is not the place to address this topic. In any case, there are two levels, at least, that I'm aware of. One is the sacredness of being able to thoroughly, perfectly, in the best, also beautifully, represent the content of the teaching, the meaning of the teaching. And this is obvious, and this was to a certain extent quite or more easily transferred from India to Tibet. Sanskrit text in particular, we know Tibetans translated Buddhist texts from many languages, but mainly from Sanskrit. And the idea that moved them was to create a language that was suitable and a suitable instrument to transport for Tibetans the Buddhist teaching. The other level of sacredness that we can identify in the Sanskrit language is that of not easy to define, but at least for me, the operativity of the language. And this means that the language is considered to be effective also beyond the rational mind, the discursive mind, the topics to be understood. But simply the sound of the language, if united with or spoken by someone who has realized those mantras, I should say, probably this is a word you are all very much familiar with, then it has power, it has efficacy, both on the inner level within the individual in terms of realization, but also outside in many ways. And I think in that the idea of spoken word having power is present in most culture, I should say. So in India, that was true from the very high levels of bija mantras, now the seed syllables, and all the way down to siddhas speaking normal language, and that what they speak really happens. I'd like to mention a funny episode from the Kabab Dunden by Taranatha, in which Jalandharipa, one of those siddhas that he describes, goes into the garden of the king and sits down under the coconut trees, and he simply says, Narikela Bhikshavo, and all the coconut fruits spontaneously come down, and he drinks the coconut water. I don't know what Bhikshavo means. I've been trying to reconstruct that in Sanskrit. But when he finished to drink, he said, Narikela upar ajahi, meaning, and this is understandable even in modern Hindi, upar aja, no, go back up. And I quote this just as an example how a siddha can even turn normal language into something efficacious, something that has power. So my idea was to try and find out how did Guru Padmasambhava, or what was his function, or what is his inherited, what is the idea that Tibetans have now with regards to the operativity of Padmasambhava with regards to Tibetan language. So let's say that the discursive side of Sanskrit was being served by a purposed, a tailor-made, let's say, language in order to represent that. But the other hand, the other side, the actual power of the language was more problematic. And Guru Padmasambhava, according to tradition, and this I think is the more relevant part in this regard, went, as is well known, according to tradition, step by step all over Tibet, covered the whole of the enormous territory, and tamed and subdued all the old gods, the gods of the Bonpos that were worshipped by the Bonpos, according to tradition, of course. And he linked them, or he bound them with oath. He made them obliged to obey to his spells, his incantations, his mantras, let's say. And I think, I have no evidence for that, but I think it's really nearly impossible to find it. But I think it is thought that he went in Tibet and taught to these deities, to these beings, to these local guardians and so on, in their language, which was Tibetan. The old gods were worshipped by the Bonpos. The text that presumably were used to worship those deities were in Tibet. And so he just applied the means of teaching that is well known in Tibet or in Buddhism in general to tame beings according to their mind and according to their language. So many of these many of these texts that are used now to worship these deities are of course and obviously in Tibetan. But I would also like to make a few other consideration, which I should have done earlier, but I forgot. There has been some debate, or still is going on, about the native tongue of Padmasambhava. I think this is a topic that would be nice to solve, would be nice to address. Some say he was, according to some, I think this is some, hypothesis that has been done in the past. He was a native of Central Asia, maybe Persia, and this does have a maybe common background to some things that also are said in the Bonpo tradition about these kind of things. And some others say, of course, he's known as Ogiempa, and they consider that he was born and original from Odiana or Ogien. So where was Odiana? Still unsolved, I think. Of course, as you know, some place it in the north of Pakistan, the Swat Valley, or around those places, some in north West India in general. Some even place it in Orissa, present-day Orissa or Odivisha. And for all of these, there are pros and cons. And there are some things that would suggest that it actually might be that. And some other, also archaeological findings and so on that would suggest that the other one is true. In any case, maybe it could be also a good idea to consider it somehow not necessarily a physical place in the world as we are generally thinking of it, but just a kind of place which is where the tantric teaching are transmitted, where all these things that we know that happen in Odhyana happen. Okay, so sorry for this digression. So let's get back to Tibet, and another, aside from the taming the gods, which I was mentioning earlier, and devising text, which then are mostly found as termas to worship the said gods. Also the deities that were then kind of obliged to become oracular deities. So those deities that are summoned by a officiating lama or a group of lamas. Those texts are, all of them are in Tibetan. So my idea here is, and obviously this maybe some people who are have the leisure to do some research about this can confirm that, is that the deities are subdued to the Tibetan text due to its inherent power, due to its being not really something that has a meaning, but also something that has inherent power. No, even and in this way, the oracle cannot avoid to come. No, they are considered to be absolutely subdued by the words spoken by the lamas. And obviously, another thing that probably happened, or that appears to have happened, is we have the same gods of the ancient times of the Bonpo world, which are subdued into obeying the Buddhist lamas. And of course, the texts that are summoning them are have a Buddhist narrative. Okay, the contents and the descriptions of the oracles that are very much similar to those of wrathful deities, of the abode of the oracles, and so on and so forth, the retinues and so forth. They are all, they have all a very much Buddhist flavor. So I think in this could be a suggestion that the idea of the power of the language, Tibetan language, was present and operative in Tibet long before Buddhism arrived there. And what Padmasambhava did in this sense was just to transform the how to say, the Dharma, the burn into Dharma, if you like, and as well the all of the imagery that is contained there is translated rather into Buddhist terms. By the way, before in an oracular session, before the Lama asks the deity to go back to its abode after having, obtained the oracular response and all that, there is a part that is the Lama teaching the Dharma or giving teaching to the deity that then can go back to its abode and apply that. Another general topic about which obviously we have heard something already this evening, or whatever that is for you, is that of Terma teachings. So Termas are understood to be generally in Tibetan. No? The Terma teaching, as far as I know, are presented at least to the public in Tibet. So what happens there? The story goes, traditionally speaking, that Guru Padmasambhava gives some teaching. He does not necessarily write them down. By the way, he also had, according to tradition, he had a translator. He was mainly Kawa Palsek, who was translating his teachings and so forth. And in any case, he gave teachings. His students, or some of his students, wrote them down. Then they kind of encrypted them into these yellow scrolls, which were some in the language of the Dakini, or some symbolic language, or some synthetic and symbolic representation of the whole text. And then later on, when the time is ready, the text were, or these yellow scrolls were recovered and then decrypted and written down by the Tertön, who is supposed to be a rebirth of the disciple, direct disciple of Guru Padmasambhava, who wrote it down. So in this way also, the Tibetan has acquired this sacredness as being also a language in which not only the old teachings coming from Sanskrit or from India or even from China are represented, but the language of production of Buddhist text. Production might be a word a little bit too, sensitive, maybe, in the sense that, of course, according to the tradition, the termas are work of Padmasambhava, but nevertheless, they kind of are translated from the yellow scrolls, from whatever that original and symbolic language is in the beginning, into Tibetan. So I think we have reached the regular time, and for your, I'm not too much more to say. Only one consideration is that we notice nowadays, as the Buddhist teachings try to find their way for interested people in non-Tibetan environments, let's say the West in general, but also, let's say, Japan or China and so forth. Well, in China in a different way. But I think it is extremely interesting to note that most Tibetan masters these days are very much reluctant to translate the texts that are to be practiced, the texts that are base of, practitioners' recitation, meditation, and so forth. I have obviously is very limited experience, but only 1 or 2 or 3 maybe centers or teachers who have their disciples to recite translated texts. And I think in the mind of the Tibetan, it might be the case that of the masters, that they consider that Western languages do not have as yet, or foreign languages, let's say, do not have as yet the aspect of being powerful, the aspect of having, you know, efficacy, true efficacy beyond meanings, beyond contents and subjects and discursive things and so on and so forth. It seems that we still do not have had some Guru Padmasambhava homologus coming into the Western countries and speaking to the local gods in their own language, and somehow giving to, I don't know, Italian or English the power to work and be effective in the world. Okay, so I think, as you might have noticed, I did not have too much time to devote to research, so just a few thoughts. And I also think that maybe people are interested in asking some questions, particularly to the other eminent scholars. But also for me, I mean, I'm nothing in.
Dobbiamo tuo audio, c'è?
Il mio audio? Ah, devo staccare.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. And this is our concluding part, so it's the right time to ask questions, should you have any. And Charles had to leave, unfortunately. Charles Ramble, he thanked everybody very much, but we still have Malcolm, Jeff, and Fabian. So please, if you have any questions whatsoever, do ask. I also just shared the main Padmasambhava page on Jeff's website, Himalayan Art Resources, which I highly recommend to see at your leisure. It's a great resource to explore. But anyway, we have about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes. So if there are any questions, you can either type them on the chat on the side, or just unmute yourselves and ask one of the eminent speakers. Thank you. Mi ha detto o chat o di, come si dice, smutarsi. Sì. Any questions? Lots of silence. Ecco. Question to Jeff on the chat. Jeff.
Something about Padmasambhava standing and the dancing. This is all late Terma. This is generally Khyentse Wangpo Terma, and so no. Yes, Sampa Lundrukma. I'm really not familiar. I've not studied, and the forms are all new. All of the paintings and sculpture we see are all just from. Really, we don't have much from the 19th century. Most is early 20th century. It's Eastern Tibetan style from Dzogchen Monastery, from Dege Gongchen, and a few others. Also shared with Dzogchen Monastery, but it's all new, and it's not my area. I'm not familiar. Sorry to say.
I would just like to add that the forms of these forms of Padmasambhava that we see were first described artistically in their iconography by Ngari Panchen back in the 16th century. He sort of created a whole sort of pantheon, described all the iconography. So while it's true that we don't have any plastic representations of these forms that you mentioned, they do go back a few hundred years prior to the 19th century. As I said, Ngari Panchen described all of the iconography in detail. Sambalundra, etc., based on the 7-chapter prayer of Padmasambhava. So this actually, when I looked at Amyeshop's account of Padmasambhava in his Vajrakalaya history this morning, in fact, he actually quotes portions of the 7-chapter prayer revealed by Rigson Godem in the 14th century. And this text, actually, the 7-chapter prayer, is really the text that, even more than the 8 names of Padmasambhava revealed by the Lama Gongdu, which we have this sort of Lama Sengye, the 8 names of Padmasambhava. It's this text, the 7-chapter prayer, Leo Dundunma, that really informs all of the later iconography of Guru Rinpoche, actually. As far as I'm aware, I haven't found any other earlier source.
Okay, I think okay. Yeah, sorry. There is a question for me, I think, regarding local gods in the West to subdue, per me, previous speaker. Would that say scientific materialism? And if so, how would Guru Rinpoche subdue them? That's an interesting question. In fact, I don't know scientific materialism exactly what is meant by that. In any case, the thing is, generally, the relationship of humans with gods or local gods in general is that of a do-death relationship. I give and you give me back. So it's a kind of worship is a sort of nourishing these gods, these beings, no? So in the West, at least, I think after Christianity took over, speaking the gods, local gods and so forth, were not worshipped anymore. They were not nourished anymore, and so they died off. That would be the idea. But obviously, this is just a suggestion, and I don't think really I have any idea what Guru Rinpoche would do here. Probably he would, use the things that we have here, the ideas that we have, to, to teach, he would translate the Dharma in a way that is understandable to those to whom it's directed to, and he would use the tools that are available there. But ce n'è un'altra per Marco.
I believe there's a question for Malcolm in the chat as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can provide a short bibliography, no problem. There's one of the sort of more unexplored areas in the Indian Tantras, as far as I'm aware, mostly because we haven't had such excellent search resources now, but now we can do, we have like Buddha Nexus, and we can do the sort of fantastic digital searches on text. And so we have actually a fair amount of information in the Indian Tantras and their related commentaries, histories, and so on and so forth. We find Odhyana mentioned many times. I know that Fabian had mentioned that, sort of perhaps we should consider Odhyana something like a, like a Pure Land, like Shambhala now would be. However, it is definitely clear to me, looking at these sources and Indian historians, Indian masters who were writing these commentaries, that for them, Odhyana was a physical reality, a place that they could actually go and visit, just like Orgenpa did in the 14th century. 14th century. He went to Odhyana, at least he claims to have gone there. And so one of the other interesting things we find out from looking at the sort of early accounts of Sakya, sort of the Sakya, the lineages that Drogmi-Lhotsawa brought to Tibet, is that we're only according to Drogmi-Lhotsawa's accounts, we're only 1 or 2 or 3 generations removed from Indrabuti III and Lakshmankara. Oh, also I wanted to mention to Jeff that Khyentse Wangpo in his Karchak of the Duptop Kundu mentions that the Virupa in Chinnamasta lineage, it's actually the sort of Sridhara lineage of Vajrayogini, which comes from Lakshmankara, is known as Brahmse Virupa. So we have like a positive identification of one Virupa who's Brahmin Virupa, and then you have the other Virupa. And interestingly enough, as some Sakya masters place Virupa contemporary with Padmasambhava, and Nawan Chodrak, actually, who's a Sakya master who lived in the 16th century, he claims that in fact Trisen Datsun had invited Virupa to Tibet at the same time that he invited Padmasambhava. So this is a kind of an interesting thing, which probably most people aren't aware. And also the Kun tradition has some early teachings, which they claim come directly from Virupa through Shantarakshita, sort of placing Padmasambhava not in the 9th century as most Western scholars would do, but the native Sakya tradition places Virupa as a contemporary of Padmasambhava, Sri Singha, and also the teacher of Shantarakshita, which is sort of interesting. Anyway, yes, I can provide bibliographies, not a problem.
Malcolm, if you want to send me the bibliography, I can send it out with the recording in due course once it's edited. And I believe there's another question for Jeff in the chat.
Just as suggested. Of course, if there are multiple Padmasambhavas and multiple Virupas, there can also be multiple Odhyanas, no?
And multiple Shambhalas as well.
So the question is, the reasons for identifying Nyangral in the early image. There's only 2 reasons for possibly imagining it to be Nyangral, and that's because of the early date of the painting and the iconography within the painting being related to Nyangral's text. That's all. There's nothing more than that. There are some inscriptions, but they're not helpful for identifying the what appears to be the donor figure or the Lama figure in the bottom right. So it's just speculation based on time period and text and probability. It also could be Nyangral's, it's possible it could be his son or it could be a grandson. So that's all I have on that.
Thank you for the question is that is it more true for Padmasambhava that it's hard to pin down than other figures? I would say that no, any figure which purports to be from India is really hard to pin down because of the complicated and haphazard way in which Tibetan Indian lineages were brought to Tibet, and also given the sort of political, I mean, the sort of whole imperial period was very heavily mythologized in the 10th and 11th centuries. So it's to the point where, for example, we have people later saying in the Menakde lineage of Dzogchen Nintig that Vimalamitra lived in Tibetan for 10 years and split and went to Wu Tai Shan. However, when we read in Samten Migdrung by Nubchen Sangye Yeshe, Nubchen Sangye Yeshe clearly states that Vimalamitra passed away in Tibet after about 10 years. And so, for example, one time Norbert Bichet was talking about his research where he found that certain people who supposedly achieved rainbow body actually were found to have died. And he didn't identify the character specifically that it was, but I suspect it might have been Vimalamitra. So yes, it's very difficult to pin down any of these sources. Is the Tibetan thing is so haphazard and the Indian sources were destroyed.
I don't know if any of you have specific answers for these questions, such as the last one.
You'd have to ask Tinley Norbu, or maybe his son. Maybe his Dzongtsar Khyentse has some idea, but if he doesn't give an explanation, then it's hard to know why.
Any speculations on why Padmasambhava did not take off in the Nawari Buddhism of Nepal? That would be an interesting one. I don't know if anybody has any possible speculations.
Well, he might have just been just another guru passing through town. I mean, there was quite a lot of them in Kathmandu at the time.
Anybody else with any questions? Or if we don't have any more questions, I just wish to thank you all so much. Oh, here, I see one last question coming. It's more of a statement I seem to read. Yeah. Okay, maybe if one of you has anything to say about the last 7-line prayers and hidden meanings, if any of you have any comment, we can make that our last question because we have to end very soon.
That's more appropriate question for like religious teaching, not here, I think.
Yeah, I concur. It's definitely more religious.
Okay, then thank you, everybody.